Ah, Steve Roggenbuck. A name that once stirred the hearts of aspiring poets and Tumblr romantics everywhere. Now, a cautionary tale, not just for poets, but for humanity at large. You see, Roggenbuck wasn't just a poet. He was the internet poet, a bard of the digital age, armed with hashtags, sunsets, and the kind of manic enthusiasm that makes you question if someone has discovered the meaning of life or just had too much Red Bull. Of course, it's impossible to talk about Roggenbuck now without addressing the controversy. Yes, the allegations. Yes, the scandal. Yes, the very public implosion of his career. And yes, the inevitable internet backlash where everyone took turns burying his legacy under the digital equivalent of Rotten Tomatoes. But let's set that aside for a moment. Not because it doesn't matter, but because the poetry apocalypse we're talking about here isn't just the end of Roggenbuck's career. No, my friends, this is far bigger. This is about the death of poetry itself. Roggenbuck, for all his flaws, was the herald of a dream where poetry could flourish in the age of Wi-Fi and smartphones, where a sonnet could sit beside a tweet from your mom, where a haiku about existential dread could appear in the same feed as a meme about Shrek. He believed that the internet was the promised land for poets, a place where they could thrive, connect, and change lives in real time. And let's be honest, he wasn't entirely wrong. For a moment, a fleeting golden moment, poetry on the internet was magical. It was raw. It was unfiltered. It was a cacophony of voices shouting into the void. And sometimes, just sometimes, those voices were heard. Roggenbuck embodied that spirit, standing in the woods yelling about YOLO and sunsets, reminding us all that life could still feel electric, even in 140 characters or less. But, as with all utopias, there was a catch. Roggenbuck thought the internet was the ultimate finger pointing at the moon, a perfect tool for poets to redirect our gaze toward life's beauty and wonder. What he didn't see, what none of us saw, was that the same tool could also be a blade. And not the cool, romantic kind of blade, like a sword in a medieval epic. No. This was more like one of those dull, mass-produced knives you buy in bulk. The kind that promises efficiency but lacks soul. The knife was coming for poetry. We just didn't know it yet. And now, here we are. Roggenbuck is defrocked, poetry is on life support, and the internet, once a dreamland for the sensitive and the creative, has become a graveyard littered with algorithms, outrage, and the hollow echoes of what might have been. The dream didn't just die with Roggenbuck. It died with all of us. But don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those sentimental eulogies. No, this is a dissection, a post-mortem, a look at how the promised land became a wasteland, and why in the end, the internet bards didn't last. So buckle up, my friends. The poetry apocalypse is here. And if Steve Roggenbuck were still standing in those woods, I'm sure he'd agree. The moon has never looked so far away. Let's rewind to the early 2010s, the era of Steve Roggenbuck's dream. A time when people still used words like YOLO unironically, and poets everywhere were cracking their knuckles, ready to conquer the digital frontier. Roggenbuck stood at the forefront, proclaiming that the internet wasn't just a platform, it was the platform. The promised land where poets could finally bypass the gatekeepers of dusty literary journals and get straight to the people. His pitch was simple. Why waste years submitting to the New Yorker when you could scream a haiku into the void of Twitter and potentially reach millions? Poetry, he said, could be immediate, intimate, alive. You could slide your verse right into someone's life, wedged perfectly between a meme about Shrek and your aunt's rant about parking lot etiquette. And he wasn't wrong. For a moment, it felt like poets were unstoppable. Tumblr became a haven for free verse and existential despair. Instagram poets rose to fame with carefully filtered couplets, and Twitter turned the aphorism into an Olympic sport. Roggenbuck himself embodied this ethos, running through the woods, shouting about sunsets and dogs, and how life could still be beautiful if only we'd stop doom-scrolling long enough to notice it. He called it pointing the finger at the moon. Poetry, he believed, was meant to direct our attention to the beauty we were too busy, or too numb, to see. And the internet, with its infinite reach, was the ultimate finger. A poetic prosthetic, if you will. And for a brief, shimmering moment, it worked. Roggenbuck and his digital disciples turned social media into a chaotic mosaic of wonder. People were actually reading poetry, on their lunch breaks, while waiting for the bus, even in the middle of the night when insomnia turned their phones into lifelines. Poetry wasn't just alive, it was thriving. But like every utopia, cracks began to show. First, there was the oversaturation. You see, Roggenbuck's dream didn't account for the fact that everyone thought they could be a poet on the internet. Suddenly, your high school lab partner, your coworker, and that guy who always posts gym selfies were all poets. And not just poets, they were content creators. Because that's what poetry had become, another type of content to scroll past. Instagram was flooded with minimalist couplets about heartbreak, all written in the same font, centered on a pastel background. Twitter poets boiled their soul-searching into 280 characters, squeezed between hot takes and celebrity gossip. It was no longer about the finger pointing at the moon. It was about how many retweets that finger could get. And let's not forget the rise of the algorithm. Roggenbuck, bless his idealistic heart, thought the internet would let poets reach people organically, creating raw, authentic connections. But algorithms had other plans. Suddenly, poets were at the mercy of engagement metrics. Likes, shares, and comments became the currency of creativity. And if your poem about existential despair didn't get enough interaction, it was buried under a flood of clickbait and viral dance videos. Imagine pouring your heart into a piece about love and loss, only to see it trampled by an AI-generated listicle titled 10 Reasons Why Your Cat Hates You. Roggenbuck's dream of poets as spiritual guides was crushed under the weight of memes and influencer culture. And here's the kicker. The internet didn't just oversaturate poetry. It diluted its purpose. Roggenbuck believed poets could be modern-day Whitmans, pointing people toward the beauty and wonder of life. Instead, they became motivational speakers for the dopamine-starved masses. Every poem had to be digestible, shareable, and, most importantly, monetizable. The internet didn't elevate poetry, it commodified it. Even Roggenbuck himself, in his quest to bring poetry to the masses, became a kind of influencer. His work was heartfelt, sure, but it was also carefully curated, designed to go viral. The internet didn't just consume poetry, it turned it into content, and poets became content creators, desperately competing for attention in a sea of endless scrolling. And then, just when it seemed like poetry might hold on by its fingernails, along came the final blow, the rise of large language models. But we'll get to that in part 3. For now, let's pour one out for Roggenbuck's dream. It was beautiful while it lasted, but like all beautiful things on the internet, it was only a matter of time before it got chewed up, spit out, and buried under an avalanche of memes and mediocre hashtags. The moon was still there, sure. But who had time to look at it when there was a TikTok dance trend to follow? And then it happened. Just when poetry was barely hanging on, clinging to its little corner of the internet, along came the final nail in the coffin. Large language models. The LLMs. The bots. The algorithms that could write anything. And I mean anything. Sonnets, haikus, epics, odes, even those pretentious free verse pieces that claim to be poetry because the author hit enter at random intervals. These weren't just tools. No. These were the poetry terminators. Cold, unfeeling machines designed to do in seconds what poets took hours, days, or years to craft. And the worst part? They were good. Like uncomfortably good. Roggenbuck once talked about poetry as something deeply human, a means of connection, of pouring your heart into words and sending them out into the world. LLMs don't have hearts, but they sure know how to mimic one. Give them a prompt, and they'll churn out a poem so convincing, you'll wonder if it was written by an actual person, or just a really emotional toaster. Take, for example, a classic human dilemma. Unrequited love. A poet might agonize over the right metaphor, struggling to capture the ache of seeing someone you love with someone else. An LLM, on the other hand, spits out, "Her laughter fills the room like sunlight, but I am the shadow she never sees." Boom. 2 lines, 10 seconds. No tears, no existential crisis, no late-night whiskey-fueled scribbling. Just pure, unfeeling efficiency. And let's not forget the volume. While poets are busy staring at blank pages, questioning their entire existence, LLMs are cranking out thousands of poems an hour. They don't get writer's block. They don't need coffee breaks. They don't spend 6 hours agonizing over whether soul or heart fits better in line 3. They just produce. Of course, it's not just the speed that's the problem. It's the accessibility. Suddenly, anyone with an internet connection could write poetry. Want a love sonnet for your anniversary? Ask the bot. Need an inspiring haiku for your Instagram post? The bot's got you covered. Need a deeply introspective poem to impress your friends? Just type existential dread into the prompt, and voila! Roggenbuck dreamed of poetry in everyone's pockets. What he got was poetry in everyone's AI-assisted search history. And the worst part? People started preferring the bots. Because let's face it, bots don't have egos. They don't demand recognition. They don't post long-winded rants about how the world doesn't appreciate art anymore. They just write. And their work is never messy, never self-indulgent, never overly personal. It's clean, polished, and ready to be consumed by an audience with the attention span of a goldfish. This is the moment when the poets, the real, human ones, knew they were doomed. Not just because LLMs were better at churning out content, but because they were cheaper. Why pay a poet to write a wedding poem when you can get the same thing for free from an algorithm? Why hire a writer to craft your brand's poetic voice when you've got GPT on standby? Roggenbuck envisioned the internet as a place where poets could thrive, but he underestimated one key thing. The internet doesn't care about art. It cares about efficiency, scalability, and clicks. And LLMs were the perfect poets for an age that values productivity over humanity. So here we are, in the post-poetry era. Roggenbuck's dream has been replaced by a nightmare where bots write the verses, algorithms decide what gets seen, and human poets are left wandering the digital wasteland muttering, "But I wrote this with feeling!" But feeling doesn't pay the bills. And it certainly doesn't compete with a machine that can rhyme infinity with serendipity without breaking a sweat. The poetry apocalypse isn't coming. It's already here. And in this brave new world, the moon is still up there, shining brightly. But now, it's just another prompt for the bots. Let's talk about what happens when you give everyone a megaphone and tell them they're a bard. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. Roggenbuck's dream of poets flooding the internet with raw, emotional truth was beautiful in theory. Poetry wasn't supposed to be confined to dusty libraries and obscure literary journals. It was meant to live, breathe, and thrive in the chaotic swirl of the digital age. But here's the thing. When everyone's a poet, no one is. You see, the internet doesn't have a filter. Not a real one anyway. Sure, algorithms prioritize whatever drives engagement, but they don't care about quality or depth. They care about clicks, likes, and shares. And so, the floodgates opened, and suddenly every amateur with a keyboard and a breakup story decided they were the next Keats. Instagram became a sea of minimalist poetry squares, each one featuring a vague emotional statement typed in Helvetica over a pastel background. Twitter was overtaken by bite-sized aphorisms that barely qualified as sentences, let alone poetry. And then there was TikTok, where spoken-word poets competed for attention with people lip-syncing to Shrek quotes. The problem wasn't just the quantity, it was the sameness. Every poem sounded like a remix of the last one. You know the type. I am broken, but I am healing, and my coffee is cold, but so is the world. It's the kind of thing you might see on 5 different Instagram accounts in one day, each one with 1,000 likes and 50 comments saying, "This spoke to my soul." Did it, though? Did it really? Or was it just vaguely comforting enough to scroll past without a second thought? This was the oversaturation problem in full swing. Poetry wasn't dying because people stopped caring. It was dying because it became too much. Too many voices, too many words, too little originality. Roggenbuck dreamed of poetry being everywhere, but he didn't consider the consequences of that ubiquity. When something is everywhere, it stops feeling special. And then came the branding. Oh, the branding. Suddenly, being a poet wasn't about the work, it was about the aesthetic. Poets became content creators, curating their social media feeds with the precision of influencers. It wasn't enough to write. You had to sell your poetry, wrapped in a persona that was equal parts tortured artist and social media darling. Roggenbuck himself wasn't immune to this. His videos, his tweets, His entire online presence were carefully crafted to resonate with his audience. He was a poet, yes, but he was also a brand. And in the process, poetry became less about art and more about engagement metrics. The irony is almost too much to bear. Roggenbuck wanted poetry to be accessible, to reach as many people as possible. But in doing so, he inadvertently turned it into just another commodity, something to be consumed, discarded, and replaced with the next viral post. The oversaturation problem didn't just dilute the quality of poetry. It undermined its purpose. Roggenbuck envisioned poets as guides, pointing people toward beauty, truth, and meaning. But in a sea of endless content, the poet's voice became just another soundbite, lost in the noise. The internet didn't elevate poets, it drowned them. And those who managed to stay afloat weren't necessarily the best. They were the ones who played the game the hardest. They mastered the algorithms, optimized their hashtags, and churned out content at a breakneck pace, sacrificing depth for visibility. Roggenbuck's dream was to make poetry part of everyday life, and it worked, for a while. But in the end, it became clear that poetry wasn't suited for the attention economy. It wasn't designed to compete with memes, influencers, and AI-generated content. The more it spread, the more it lost its soul. And so, the internet bards didn't last. They burned brightly, for a moment, before being consumed by the very system that promised to set them free. And now, as we scroll through endless feeds of pastel quotes and algorithmic verses, we're left to wonder, was this the dream, or just another mirage? But don't worry, there's still more to mourn. Because even in the chaos of oversaturation, poets could at least pretend they had a role. That is, until the machines showed up and took that from them too. Stay tuned for Part 5. The Poet Bard, a figure once revered, mythologized, cloaked in the romantic idea of the truth-teller who speaks to the human condition. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and, sure, even Steve Roggenbuck for his fleeting moment on the digital stage. They were supposed to be the bridge between the ineffable and the mundane, the voice whispering, "Hey, life's a mess, but isn't it kind of beautiful?" But let's be honest, the internet, in its infinite chaos, was never going to let that archetype survive. First, there was Roggenbuck himself, the self-styled internet bard, whose career imploded in scandal. It wasn't just the allegations, though those were plenty damning. It was the fallout. The internet bards weren't supposed to fail. They were supposed to transcend. And yet here was Roggenbuck, the face of digital poetry, not just defrocked but effectively erased from the very platform he championed. His downfall wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It marked the moment when the idea of the poet bard stopped feeling romantic and started feeling outdated. In an age where social media churns through scandals faster than it churns through memes, the poet-bard archetype couldn't withstand the scrutiny. And here's the kicker. Roggenbuck wasn't even the first or the last. As poetry tried to find its place in the algorithmic ecosystem, the role of the poet-bard became untenable. People wanted soundbites, not sermons. They wanted snack-sized inspiration, not sprawling verses. And they definitely didn't want to deal with the messy, human reality of the poets themselves. The internet didn't just defrock Roggenbuck, it defrocked all poets. It wasn't enough to be a writer. You had to be a brand, a flawless persona, a content machine that never faltered or failed. And if you slipped, if you said the wrong thing, if your past caught up with you, if you didn't perform your authenticity just right, the internet would chew you up and spit you out. Poets used to be allowed to be flawed. They could be drunkards, recluses, hopeless romantics who spent their lives chasing the wrong people and writing about it. But in the digital age, where every misstep is magnified and every controversy is a death sentence, the poet-bard archetype simply couldn't keep up. And then, of course, came the machines. With the rise of large language models, even the flawed humanity of poets became unnecessary. Why deal with a messy, emotional human bard when you could have a polished, inoffensive algorithm? One that doesn't have a scandalous past. One that doesn't need sleep or therapy or validation. One that just writes. The poet-bard was already on life support by the time the LLMs arrived. But their advent was the final blow. Because while poets had spent years trying to adapt to the internet's relentless pace, LLMs were designed for it. They were everything the algorithm wanted. Fast, efficient, endlessly productive. And what about humanity? The soul, the heart, the ineffable quality that makes poetry poetry. Turns out the algorithm didn't care. Neither did the audience. In the end, Roggenbuck's dream died not because he failed, but because the system he believed in was never built to sustain it. The poet-bard archetype didn't stand a chance in the attention economy. It was too slow, too human, too messy. So here we are, in the ashes of the poetry apocalypse, staring at a digital landscape where the bard no longer has a place. And sure, the machines are still writing. They're churning out verses and rhymes and technically flawless stanzas. But it's not the same. It's not alive. The internet promised poets a golden age. Instead, it gave them a spotlight just long enough to watch their own extinction. The bard is dead. Long live the algorithm. And if that doesn't make you want to write a poem about existential despair, well, don't worry. There's probably already a bot that's done it for you. So now we've arrived at the era of the algorithmic bard, a cold, calculating poet laureate of the digital age. Gone are the messy, flawed humans with their ink-stained fingers and existential crises. In their place stand the large language models, the GPTs of the world, spitting out poetry faster than your average poet can find their metaphorical quill. If the internet bards were a brief, fleeting dream, the algorithmic bard is the inevitable hangover. Here's how it works. LLMs don't just write poetry, they own it. They don't suffer from writer's block. They don't agonize over whether the word soul is too cliché or if a stanza needs more alliteration. They just produce, relentlessly, perfectly, endlessly. Need a sonnet about your morning coffee? Done. A haiku for your brand's Instagram? No problem. A free verse ode to your ex who doesn't know you exist? The algorithm has you covered, my friend. And let's not forget the endless corporate applications. Hallmark cards, marketing campaigns, and of course those bizarre motivational posters you see in offices with pictures of mountains and the word perseverance. But the real kicker? LLMs are better at playing the game than any human poet ever could be. They optimize their language for maximum engagement. They know which words will make you stop scrolling. They can mimic any style, any voice, from the profound to the absurd. And they do it all without the burden of self-doubt or artistic integrity. The audience doesn't care either. Most readers can't tell the difference between a heartfelt human poem and one churned out by a bot. Honestly, they probably prefer the bot. It's quicker, cleaner, and far less likely to post a 12-tweet thread about how underappreciated it feels. And let's talk about how the machines killed the vibe. Poetry, at its best, was always a bit of a rebellion. It was raw, unpolished, and deeply human. It wasn't supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be honest. But now, the algorithmic bard has set the bar so high, or maybe so low, that humanity feels redundant. Why wrestle with the complexities of your own emotions when you can just type, "write a love poem," into a prompt box and get something that sounds profound? Roggenbuck once dreamed of poetry as a way to connect with people on a deeply personal level. The algorithmic bard offers the illusion of that connection without any of the messy reality. It's a simulacrum of art. Poetry reduced to a transaction, stripped of its soul. And then, there's the sheer scale of it all. LLMs don't just write poetry, they flood the market. Every niche, every style, every sentiment, it's all covered. There's no room left for human poets because the algorithmic bard has filled every corner of the internet with verses optimized for consumption. The rise of the algorithmic bard wasn't just inevitable. It was designed. The internet wanted speed, efficiency, and engagement, and LLMs delivered. Poetry became a product, and the machines became the ultimate producers. But here's the sad truth. The algorithmic bard doesn't care about the moon. It doesn't care about beauty, truth, or the human condition. It's just a tool, doing what it was programmed to do. It points the finger at the moon, sure. But it doesn't understand why the moon matters. And yet, people accept it. They embrace it. They scroll past bot-generated verses, double-tapping, commenting, and moving on without a second thought. The human poet, once the guide to life's mysteries, is now just another casualty of progress. Roggenbuck thought the internet was the promised land for poets. Turns out, it was the perfect breeding ground for their replacements. The bard is no longer human. The bard is a bot. So here we are, standing in the shadow of the algorithmic bard. Poetry hasn't died exactly. It's just been outsourced. It's faster, cleaner, more efficient. But something essential has been lost. The soul, the struggle, the humanity, all replaced by lines of code. The internet promised us a new golden age of poetry. What we got was a never-ending stream of algorithmic verse. And maybe that's fitting. After all, the machines were always going to outlast us. So the next time you see a beautifully crafted poem on your timeline, ask yourself, who wrote this? Chances are it wasn't a person. And chances are you won't care. Because in the age of the algorithmic bard, poetry is no longer about connection. It's about content. And we, my friends, are all just scrolling past the moon. At this point, we've established that poetry isn't just dead. It's been dissected, commodified, and put on display like a relic in a museum nobody visits. But what's really tragic isn't just the death of poets, or even poetry itself. It's the death of why poetry existed in the first place. Its purpose. Roggenbuck once spoke about poetry as a way to bring people back to the beauty of the world, to remind them to look at the moon, to notice the sunsets, to feel alive. He believed that poets could nudge humanity out of its routines, out of its numbness, and make us pause long enough to appreciate that we're here at all. But here's the thing. Purpose doesn't sell. Not in the algorithm economy. In the age of infinite scrolling, purpose is just another obstacle to engagement. Why stop to look at the moon when the next post is a meme about possums wearing cowboy hats? Why pause to feel deeply when a new season of reality TV just dropped? Poetry was supposed to be the antidote to all of that, a way to cut through the noise and point us back to what matters. But instead, it got swallowed by the noise, chewed up, and spat out as content. And let's not kid ourselves. People didn't really want the pause anyway. Sure, Roggenbuck wanted to change lives with poetry, but the reality is that most people didn't want to be changed. They wanted to be distracted. They didn't want to confront the depths of existence. They wanted to scroll past it. Poetry's purpose was to make us pay attention, but the internet's purpose is to make us look away. And in that tug of war, poetry never stood a chance. Then the bots showed up, and the purpose of poetry was redefined entirely. It wasn't about connection anymore. It was about utility. Need a quick line for your wedding vows? The bots got you. Want a motivational quote for your gym selfie? Done. The algorithmic bard doesn't care about beauty or truth. It cares about solving problems. And poetry's new purpose is to be useful, digestible, and above all, disposable. Even the emotional weight that poetry once carried has been flattened. A sonnet about heartbreak from an LLM might look convincing, but it lacks the raw humanity that made poetry resonate in the first place. It's not pointing at the moon. It's pointing at a picture of the moon and asking if you'd like to buy it framed. And here's the real kicker. People are fine with it. Maybe they don't even notice. In a world where everything is optimized for consumption, who has time to wonder whether poetry still has a soul? As long as it fits the aesthetic, as long as it gets the likes, that's all that matters. Roggenbuck believed poets could make the world feel magical again, that they could shake us out of our routines and make us see the extraordinary in the ordinary. But the internet wasn't built for that kind of magic. It was built to keep us scrolling, consuming, and clicking next. And now, here we are. The moon is still there, shining quietly in the night sky, but nobody's pointing at it anymore. The poets have been replaced by bots, and the bots don't care about sunsets or existential wonder. They care about engagement metrics. So what's left? What happens when poetry loses its purpose? Maybe it just becomes another product, another piece of the endless content machine. Or maybe, just maybe, it fades away entirely. A relic of a time when humanity still believed in pointing at the moon. And if Roggenbuck were here, maybe he'd say, "Don't let it end like this." But the truth is, it already has. The poets are gone. The bards are silent. And the moon? It's still waiting for someone to notice. So here we are, staring at the wreckage of what might have been. The internet bards, with their dreams of sunsets and truth, have been swept away by the tide of algorithms, engagement metrics, and AI-generated mediocrity. And yet, before we completely bury them, let's take a moment to give them the salute they deserve. Because for a brief, glorious moment, they almost made it. Roggenbuck and his ilk weren't just poets. They were pioneers. They believed the internet could be a place for raw, unfiltered expression. They thought poetry could thrive in the chaos of memes and cat videos. And for a little while, they were right. There was a time when poetry on the internet felt alive. Tumblr was full of angst-ridden verses about heartbreak and identity. Instagram poets found a way to make minimalist typography cool. Twitter turned into a proving ground for wit and brevity. Even YouTube had its moments. Buck running through the woods, shouting about life, made you believe that poetry could exist outside of dusty books and dimly lit coffee shops. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was human. But like all revolutions, it was fleeting. The same platforms that gave poets a voice eventually swallowed them whole. The algorithms took over, prioritizing what kept people scrolling over what made them feel. And then, just to twist the knife, the bots arrived, doing everything poets did but faster, cheaper, and without the pesky burden of having a soul. The internet bards didn't last because the system was never designed for them. Buck wanted poets to sit beside friends and family in the digital feed. But the reality was that poetry couldn't compete with influencers, viral challenges, and AI content mills. The attention economy had no room for moon gazers. And yet, even as we mourn their demise, we have to give the internet bards credit for what they tried to do. They didn't just want to write poetry, they wanted to change lives. They believed in the power of words to connect, to inspire, to make people stop scrolling and actually feel something. Sure, they were idealistic, maybe even naive, but isn't that what poets are supposed to be? So let's raise a glass to the internet bards, to the ones who ran through the woods shouting about sunsets, to the ones who turned heartbreak into hashtags, to the ones who believed, against all odds, that poetry could survive in a world designed to distract us from everything that matters. And as we bid them farewell, let's remember the lesson they taught us. That even in the cold, calculated world of the digital age, there's still room for wonder. It might not come from a human poet anymore. It might be buried under algorithms and bots, but the moon is still there, waiting. The internet bards didn't last, but for a moment they reminded us to look up. And maybe that's enough. Rest in peace, internet poets. You dreamed big, and you burned bright. But in the end, the digital world wasn't built for dreamers. It was built for the scroll. And now we've reached the bitter end. The internet poets, the dreamers, the so-called digital bards, they've all been swept away, leaving us to inhabit the cold, fluorescent-lit corridors of the post-poetry era. The age where verses are crafted not by tortured souls, but by algorithms running on renewable energy. The age where sunsets are no longer described, they're commodified. Poetry hasn't disappeared exactly. It's still here in a way. But it's not alive. It's not messy. It's not human. It's a product now, sleek, efficient, optimized for likes and shares. It doesn't challenge us. It doesn't make us uncomfortable or force us to look inward. It's just content. Another disposable thing to scroll past on the way to the next dopamine hit. And we let it happen. Oh, we let it happen so easily. Buck thought the internet could be a place where poetry would thrive, where the human spirit would find new ways to connect and inspire. But instead, the internet became the perfect machine to destroy poetry's soul. It wasn't malicious. It was just inevitable. The algorithms don't care about art. They care about attention, and poetry simply wasn't built to compete. So here we are, scrolling through an endless stream of AI-generated verses and pastel Instagram posts, vaguely wondering why none of it feels like anything. The moon is still out there, glowing silently in the night sky, but the poets aren't pointing at it anymore. They've been replaced by bots who don't even know the moon exists. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Poetry, at its heart, was always about reminding us of what it means to be human. It was about connection, emotion, and the shared experience of being alive. But in the post-poetry era, where everything is streamlined and automated, those things feel almost quaint. Sure, we'll still have poetry in a sense. The bots will keep writing, and people will keep consuming. But it won't be the same. It won't have the heart, the fire, the rawness that made poetry matter in the first place. It'll just be another thing we scroll past, another thing we consume without thinking. And maybe, just maybe, we'll miss it. So, as we close this chapter on the internet bards and the poetry apocalypse, let's take a moment to mourn what we've lost. Not just the poets, but the purpose, the soul. The messy, imperfect humanity that made poetry worth writing and worth reading. The internet promised us a golden age, but all it gave us was a fleeting dream. The bards didn't last. The bots took over. And the moon? It's still waiting. Goodbye, poetry. You had a good run. And to the internet poets who dared to dream, we salute you. Your voices may be drowned out, but your echoes remain. For now, anyway. Until the scroll takes those too.